Sequestering carbon, we've heard why we should do it. We've heard some really brilliant ways to do it. We've even heard that you could get $20 a ton for carbon dioxide being sequestered, possibly. And I'm going to explore the territory a little bit. So, effectively, I'd like to understand the audience or the crowd here a little better. How many of you are actually actively engaged directly in farming? If you could raise your hands. Very good, very good. Okay. How many of you have farms bigger than 40 hectares? Okay, just a couple. So most of you are engaged in the smaller farming, if you're engaged in farming. And this is important, because when it comes to systems to put in place to monitor how much carbon gets put into the soil, we have to take into account that a lot of the early activity is going to be the smaller farmers. It would be great if every farmer had thousands of hectares and we could just have a single system to monitor that. But that'll happen, but that'll probably be later. So I'm just going to break down what I'll cover. How much carbon can we put into the ground? What is the impact of climate change on the carbon market? There are two markets that we have to take into account, and what are the changes, the disruptive changes that we can see coming that are going to change those markets? And what kind of prices are we looking at for carbon? And finally, what are the protocols for sampling and measuring carbon? How can we practically do this? So it's a lot to cover, so I will probably flash through quite a lot because we really don't need to go over stuff that we've already done. Amount of carbon that can be sequestered per hectare per year. We need to understand how carbon gets sequestered, which I think we know pretty well. How it stays sequestered, maybe we haven't covered that so well. Estimated amounts of carbon that can be sequestered. We've talked about that, we'll look at it. So how does carbon get sequestered? So we know that we get the carbon dioxide absorbed, and through photosynthesis it gets turned into food. That food finds its way down into the roots of the plant. About 50% of it with those kind of plants that we're looking at in croplands. With trees it can be 80%. And then of that food that gets down there, the roots have to live. So they take about half of that, and the other half they give to the soil if the soil can use it, if it has the microbiology. And eventually either the roots break down, the material breaks down, or the exudates feed the soil microbiology. So it's pretty simple. How does it stay there? Well, we've heard about the soil food web, and probably the fungal element is the biggest factor in keeping the carbon in the soil. Because fungi actually are continuously growing, and they're making these carbon tubes. And a lot of these carbon tubes are becoming dead material because of the vast amount of growth that happens. And it gets left in the soil that way. Then it gets obviously approached by bacteria and other things, and gets converted eventually through many cycles into a permanent state of carbon, which could be mineralized and could stay there for 1,000 years. So there is a cycle where carbon over time will actually be made pretty permanent in the soil. That's an example here of just how big Mycorrhizal, which is a particularly important fungus because it connects the plant to the minerals in the soil, actually has part of its existence inside the root of the plant. So it's a pretty magic thing. It actually has the plant and the mycorrhizal fungi actually live together in a very tight connection. And you can see, this is a tiny little pine seedling, but you can see the size of that fan of fungus, which is really spreading through the soil. In actual fact, we now have evidence that these mycorrhizal fungi can spread more than a mile from trees and bring nutrients from considerable distances. So how much carbon can we actually get into the ground? Is it really practical? We've heard some amazing numbers. So let's just look at some estimates that I put together from bits of research and anecdotal evidence that I thought were the kind of things we could take. With somebody starting out, looking at annual crops, we could get 1.5 to 3 when we get going, and we might be able to get it right up to 19 tons per hectare per year. The best I encountered in that was a carrot farmer in South Africa who was getting an average over 3 years of 16 tons per hectare. And he was farming in very sandy soils. He had a lot of rotation, and part of that rotation was rye grass, which he fed his cattle. And he did a thing very similar to what we just heard about. So you can see he also put a lot of compost in. So that's how he managed to get 16 tons. So we've heard about the holistic grazing. I've given you some estimates there. Perennial crops can go much higher, but we are counting the carbon deeper with perennial crops. Root systems can go down very deep. Well, we saw even with grass, can be quite deep. But I believe I've encountered in South Africa a tree that had roots about 200 meters below the surface of the earth. And they were big, healthy, living roots. And that was in a cave. They call the Kango caves in the Cape. If you're ever there, you might find yourself seeing that tree. So how's the market going to change as climate change becomes more evident? So let's have a look at it in terms of trends and tipping points, public awareness, and market sensitivity to certain events. So carbon dioxide is added to the atmosphere and stays there. This is something a lot of people don't realize. It's actually going to be there in 10,000 years, what we add. It's not going away unless we take it out. So this is quite important because it means we really are doing something a little crazy by just throwing tons of stuff, but it's not going to go away. Luckily, methane only stays for about 12 years, so although it's terrible, it has a much shorter life cycle. 40-year lag time, I've heard some people say 100-year lag time, a long lag time. Some people have said as short as 25 years. I think it depends on what we're measuring, but the fact is there is a very long lag time. So what we've put into the atmosphere this year is only going to impact us in many years' time. However, there's one way we can change that, if we take a bunch of carbon out of the atmosphere. So these are all the reasons why we need to change things. But the public are not aware of this. What the public are aware of is this acceleration of temperature increases. Last year was the hottest year recorded since we've been recording temperatures. This year is probably going to be the second hottest year. In fact, I'd say it's trying hard to be as hot as last year in the last few months, because you see the trees outside and you can see it's much warmer than usual at this time. Permafrost melting is a possible tipping point. Now, we heard a very interesting talk about peat and permafrost. There is some new research showing that the crystalline methane structures in the ocean, just on the continental shelves, which are releasing, as the water warms, they're releasing a lot of methane, that there are bacteria growing in these areas that convert that methane to carbon dioxide. So it's looking like we could use bacteria wisely here and maybe not have such a big impact from these disastrous looking events. But perhaps we can't do anything about the open water in the Arctic, because every square meter of extra water that's open is absorbing huge amount more heat than the ice that was there before. And that's why the Arctic is so much warmer. It has heated up so much more than even this part of the world. And of course, the biggest tipping point, I think, that it will eventually, you might say, cause the world to swing around is the rising ocean. And it's not that the rising ocean will just cause everything to suddenly change because water's in my basement. It's because we'll realize there's going to be water in my basement. And then my property's worthless. How many $1 trillion of property will suddenly become worthless when people realize that? So the perspective, how are people seeing this? And people are slowly coming around. The scientific consensus is it's changing faster than we thought. We have to do more than we thought. We've seen this, that the level of carbon dioxide equivalence in the atmosphere is really high. And we want to be careful not to just accept a 2-degree change as our target. We really have to make it 1.5. And of course, I say we've reached 0.9. That's what we've reached this year. Last year, actually, it went up to 1 degree. So it goes up and down. And I won't bore you with graphs. We've seen them. You can see last year jumping up there. This year's down a little. This is an interesting projection. It shows different pathways depending on how much we reduce emissions. And the red one is actually not even going to keep us safe. But you can see it's a tough one to get. And that one, nobody's projecting that we'll get the red one. But that's the only one that really we have to get. So the two markets that we're dealing with here are the cap and trade market, which exists in Quebec. It also exists in Ontario. Just recently, Ontario joined. And it has been associated, the Ontario-Quebec group have associated with California, with the cap and trade market there. So there is a kind of, I would call it a coalition of states that are operating in this market. These people, unfortunately, do not really accept the kind of numbers that we heard from Blaine. How many tons of carbon dioxide he has sequestered, because they haven't accepted the protocols yet. So the cap and trade is not a very good market for farmers to think of trading on, because they haven't accepted measuring carbon in the soil. We hope, will accept. VCS is the verified carbon standard. It's probably the most accepted international standard on measuring, verifying that you have actually done something with carbon. And we hope that within 2 to 3 years they will accept that measurement, the verified carbon standard measurement. Then everyone can have carbon measured in their soils and get paid for it. The other market is more interesting, the voluntary market. That means this has nothing to do with cap and trade. This is just companies that want to show, mainly their shareholders, but also their customers, that they are doing something for the planet. They will accept contracts, maybe 5 to 20-year contracts, where they say, we'll measure the carbon at year 1, and then in 5 years' time, and we'll say, you'll get paid something for it. And we've even got contracts where they're prepared to put some money in so that the farmers can switch to actually sequester the carbon. Both require third-party verification. So when we look at cap and trade, it's a government-driven system. And we're looking at what impacts that. Well, what happened in the United States with cap and trade we had the Northeastern States Cap and Trade Agreement, and they set their targets about 2007 or some year before that. And then we had the big recession. So everybody stopped using a lot of fuel. Then we had fracking. And nobody measured all the methane that escapes from the fracking process. So they only measured how much all these utility companies are now switching to natural gas, which they are. Coal-fired stuff is nearly dead because natural gas is so much less expensive and nobody's counting that methane. So it's looking as if nobody needs to buy carbon credits because none of these companies has exceeded the cap. They're getting under the cap. So the result is the whole market collapsed, the price of carbon went down. So that's the problem you have with those kind of systems. However, we'll see there's some hope in Quebec. The voluntary market is much more complex. Public relations is a big part of it. We've got to look at the opportunities and needs of the companies, and we've got to match that up. We've got to say, why are they interested? And shareholders will be one of the big factors. How expensive are the projects? Another factor. A lot of these companies like to buy into these big rainforest protection. But rainforest protection is getting a bad name because we just heard earlier the Amazon is burning. So you've gone and now put your money into sequestering carbon in protecting rainforest, and a massive fire sweeps through. You can't stop it, not in a rainforest. So what do you do then? So things are swinging away from rainforest. However, whichever way we do it, we need a broker or retailer as well as third-party verification. So the farmers are going to have to deal with somebody. They can't just go out and say, I've got some carbon here to sell. And so this soil sequestration is actually indirectly recognized by the cap and trade system. In California, they've allowed people to claim it based on how much compost they put on the soil. And if you put 4 or 5 tons per acre, okay, let's multiply that up by 2.5 to get hectares. It's a serious amount of tons of compost. They will give you half a ton of carbon dioxide is being sequestered, which is a bit of a joke. Because if you did that kind of compost, and it was good compost, and you did it right, you would probably sequester 5 tons of carbon dioxide. So that's the problem. Really, we want to look at the voluntary market. And the best opportunities that I've encountered in my research in this area is to look at a company like Applied Ecological Services. Now, they're out of Minnesota. They've been, Steve Applebaum, who is the chief executive there, has been involved in this for years. He was one of the people who wrote the protocols for measuring sequestered carbon. So he's also a really efficient, intelligent, pleasant individual, and I would recommend that if we're going to do something as a group, or farmers want to get together and do something, I would start with them. And I've spoken to Steve, and he said he's absolutely interested. It's Applied Ecological Services, and I didn't actually write the website down, but if you Google it, you'll certainly find it. They are very big. They have a lot of operations around the place. They don't only do carbon sequestration, they do a lot of other things. They manage projects that increase and measure soil carbon for farmer remuneration. They use regenerative agriculture and adaptive multi-paddock or holistic grazing management. And they are really looking to sequester millions of metric tons. So they've got mega projects. But they do group farmers together. So they're quite happy to work with a large group of farmers. And of course, the Verified Carbon Standard, they're the ones who actually got it accepted. So they are the people we would look at recommending. 5-year market forecast. Now this is interesting. This is cap and trade. This was done by ICF Consulting for the Ontario Energy Board. They put a minimum next year at 17. By the way, it has already reached 18 in Quebec, and a maximum of 67 next year, right? By 2028, 27 and 108. Very promising. Dubious about it. And I'll show you why. Here's a little less exciting. This is what the voluntary market was last year, okay? Based on 162 million tons of CO2 equivalent sales, renewable energy $1.40, forestry land use, which we'd fall into $5.10, and other efficiency and fuel switching $2.90. So what is going to impact this pricing? We've got to have people recognizing that reduction is, we've got to have something more than reduction. We've got to actually have a way of sequestering carbon that's not too expensive, because all these chemical ways of sequestering carbon have turned out to be too expensive. Also putting them into abandoned mine shafts and things has turned out to be problematical. So the 4 per 1,000 program, I put 25 countries because that's what I had when I first put this presentation together years ago. It's already up to 39, so you can see it's going to have a big impact on a lot of NGOs and other organizations. So the other big factor we have that's going to influence this is, if we can market it, is the other benefits. When you're putting carbon in the soil, you're not just putting carbon in the soil. It's all the other stuff, the water, the quality of the food, it goes on and on, we know. A good case for having separate pricing for carbon sequestration. Instead of having it at the same price as anything else, it's got other benefits. It should be paid at a better price, like the $20 that we heard Elaine talk about. And we already have some multinational corporations setting targets in this area. Walmart is already claiming massive millions of tons of carbon equivalent emissions reduction through a project with the Environmental Defense Fund. And we have Unilever with some really stiff targets they've set to meet by about, I think it's 2028, and General Mills by 2025. So these big companies are targets for us to get in touch with, and people like Steve Apfelbaum would be one to go to. So what's going to impact this? So what we're going to find is carbon prices are going to go down because of renewable energy costs going down. Carbon prices are going to go down because we're switching to electric vehicles and sharing and all that kind of thing. But we're going to get higher carbon prices when we change the perspective. Once people realize just reducing is not enough. So we'll get the reduction, we'll get it, people will say, wow, look at us, we're doing so well, prices will drop, and then they'll go up. So we'll see over the next 5 years, prices will drop, and then at the end, because of various things, we'll see they'll shoot up. And we suspect 3 to 5 years, we'll see that curve go. Protocols, pretty much what was developed by Applied Ecological Services, all available at the Verified Carbon Standard. They use a stratification system to reduce sample density, so you don't have to spend so much money. They do use random sampling. Cost per hectare drops from tens of dollars per hectare to cents per hectare. And basically, the measurement covers both inorganic and total carbon. Both organic and inorganic, the whole lot. So that's their standard testing. Just to go through this quickly, we have to come to an end now, is the Verified Carbon Standard is probably going to be the one we would use here, and you can see there why. It also includes carbon footprints of other things such as fertilizer use. So if you're not using fertilizer, you can claim that as a benefit. It does require third party. So we come to the end. What can we do? We can improve the soil food web. All these things we've heard about, they improve the soil food web. We can increase the plant exudates, photosynthesis. We need more green, just like we've heard. Increase root mass and depth, compaction layers. We haven't really talked about keyline plowing, big one. Minimize carbon footprint of all the inputs you have to your farm. And what you can do now, besides building the soil food web, is look for composting resources and skills. You want compost that has the full soil food web in it. That's the secret. No good having some organic matter if you're not introducing the biology, if you want to get that biology established quickly. Switch to no-till, obviously, cover crops, holistic grazing. You want to use your deep ripper or your keyline plowing. You can use compost tea with it, and you want to start practicing. That's basically it. Build the soil food web. So, as I say, applied ecological services are the ones I'd go to. They're happy to work with Dr. Ingham's methods. They want to scale, they're looking for more farmers, and they're keen to work here. They're already active in Alberta. So for more information, you can email me, jimmysinton@gmail.com. Really simple to remember that. I'll be happy to put you in touch with Steve. And thank you very much.